My boyfriend and I have been dating for a year and he wants to get more serious, but I don't think we're actually that compatible. Do opposites actually attract? The relationship had started like many others, a blend of curiosity and cautious optimism. A year in, and now here I was, staring down the crossroads of uncertainty. My boyfriend and I had, by all accounts, navigated the first year with relative ease. He was kind, easygoing, and always eager to please. Yet, in recent weeks, his hints and direct questions about deepening our commitment had stirred a whirlwind of doubts I couldn't ignore. He had begun dropping not-so-subtle comments about moving in together. "It would be nice to wake up next to you every day," he'd say, his voice tinged with hope. And then there were the moments he'd mention wanting me to meet his parents, a step that in his eyes seemed monumental, though in mine, it felt weighted with implications. We were opposites in so many ways that I wondered if our differences were charming contrasts or signs of impending friction. The classic question loomed: do opposites truly attract, or were we doomed to clash? I'd been poring over our relationship, dissecting every interaction, trying to discern whether we were building a foundation or merely coasting on the smoothness of initial compatibility. He had lived a childhood defined by solitude, the archetypal nerd, as he often joked, with a library of books and video games as his closest companions. As an only child, he seemed to carry an air of self-sufficiency tinged with quiet melancholy, a trait he'd never explicitly acknowledged but one I felt in the spaces between his words. His history of serious relationships was short, just one ex, and a year of cohabitation that ended abruptly when he decided it wasn't right. In contrast, my life had been a whirlwind. As the eldest daughter, I had carried the weight of responsibility from a young age, orchestrating family dynamics and navigating life with a mix of resilience and resourcefulness. He teased me about how I had lived 100 lives before we'd even met, a remark that carried admiration and, perhaps, intimidation. As our peers raced toward engagements, weddings, and mortgages, the societal timer ticked louder in the background. His recent eagerness to take the next step felt, at times, like a response to external pressures rather than an organic evolution of our relationship. Did he see me as the one, or was I a convenient partner in a life timeline he was trying to fast-track? My own aspirations aligned with settling down eventually, but every time I envisioned that life, it was a blank canvas when it came to him. What complicated matters further was his current living situation. Despite earning an enviable 6-figure salary, he still resided with his parents. His reasoning was practical, saving for a house in an exorbitantly expensive housing market, but the arrangement made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that his desire to move in together was more about escaping his parents' home than a genuine step toward building a life with me. In moments of clarity, I wondered if I was overthinking everything. After all, relationships required compromise and adjustment, didn't they? And yet, there was a gnawing feeling that wouldn't leave me, a sense that compatibility was more than just navigating surface-level differences. It was about shared dreams, emotional intimacy, and a connection that felt unshakable even when faced with life's inevitable challenges. He seemed so sure of us, so convinced that we had something worth fighting for. But I couldn't help but question, was he seeing the real me, or the version of me he wanted to believe in? And more importantly, was I seeing the real him? Or was I romanticizing his kindness and mistaking convenience for love? As the holidays loomed closer, with their inherent pressure for closeness and joy, the weight of his expectations and my hesitations hung in the air like an unspoken secret. I loved the idea of love, of partnership, of building a future. But could I do that with him when my heart whispered uncertainties I couldn't quite articulate? I often wondered if the roots of our differences were in the lives we'd lived before meeting each other. I was the kind of person who thrived on filling my day with activity, not necessarily grand adventures, but purposeful moments that made me feel like I was living life fully. Whether it was exploring a new cafe or finally tackling a Pinterest recipe, there was joy in the doing. Even something as mundane as running errands felt satisfying if it meant experiencing the world. The holidays only amplified my enthusiasm. The glitter of lights, The warmth of gingerbread baking in the oven, these things brought me joy. My boyfriend, on the other hand, seemed content in the stillness. He called himself boring with a sort of resigned pride, as if it were an immutable fact of his character. He enjoyed sitting at home, immersed in movies, YouTube rabbit holes, or video games. It wasn't that he refused to join me in my activities. If I asked him, he'd come along. But there was always an undertone of reluctance, the occasional complaint about traffic, crowds, or even the effort of getting dressed for the outside world. When I thought about how many Saturdays we'd spent sitting through a 3-movie marathon on his couch, I felt a pang of frustration. I didn't even care what we were watching. I just wanted to be doing something more dynamic. It wasn't just about the activities. The quietness between us had started to feel heavier over time. While I didn't consider myself overly talkative, I found myself becoming the chatterbox of our relationship. At first, I thought it was a phase. Maybe he was just more reserved, needing time to open up. But a year in, his silences hadn't softened. If anything, they felt more pronounced. When we were together, the bulk of our conversations came from me asking about his day, sharing random anecdotes, trying to create a rhythm that felt natural. I didn't mind it, not at first. But there were moments, like the long drive we took recently, where I simply didn't have the energy to carry the weight of our dialogue. I decided to stay quiet, curious to see what would happen. The silence grew until it felt suffocating, a bubble pressing against my chest. When I finally broke it by asking what he was thinking about, his answer nothing was both predictable and disheartening. He wasn't being dismissive. I genuinely believed that he wasn't thinking about much of anything. That's just how his mind works, steady, calm, and unperturbed. But for me, it was hard not to take it personally. I wanted to feel connected, to know what swirled in his head during those quiet moments. Yet his answers were always the same, nothing or, on the rare occasion, you. While sweet in its simplicity, it left me yearning for more. I wondered if this dynamic was sustainable. Relationships didn't need constant chatter, and I appreciated comfortable silences as much as the next person. But was it wrong to want something deeper? Was it unfair to want conversations that stretched into the realms of vulnerability, curiosity, and shared dreams? There was a growing sense of imbalance. I was putting in the effort to bridge the gap between us, trying to find common ground, yet I wasn't sure if he even noticed. And while he was never unkind or dismissive, his reticence felt like a wall I couldn't climb. It wasn't just about words, it was about feeling truly seen and understood. In those quiet moments, my mind would wander. Were we simply two people with different operating systems, doomed to misunderstand each other? Or was I expecting too much? Maybe relationships were about meeting in the middle, and I needed to accept that he showed his affection in other ways through his actions rather than words. Still, the doubt lingered. How much of myself would I have to shrink or compromise to make this work? Could I find joy in the quiet, or would it slowly erode my sense of fulfillment? These questions looped endlessly in my head, their answers as elusive as the depth I craved in our conversations. This was the part that kept me awake at night. The nagging feeling that no matter how much time we spent together, there was a wall between us that I couldn't break through. We were physically present, sure, but emotionally, that was another story. Most of our evenings together played out like a script on repeat, sitting on my couch, another movie queued up, the room filled with the sounds of actors' voices rather than our own. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy his company. He was calm, steady, and reliable, qualities I truly appreciated. But something felt missing, like we were skimming the surface of what a real connection could be. Our conversations, especially on dates, barely scratched the veneer of who we were as people. How was your day? Any plans this weekend? Maybe a funny story from work. But those topics felt like placeholders, distractions from diving into the deep waters of who we really were. When I tried to steer us toward those deeper conversations, asking about the things that mattered to me, our goals, our values, what we both wanted from the future, I was always met with resistance. "Why ruin a nice day?" he'd say, a smile softening the blow. To him, these were heavy topics, unnecessary burdens on an otherwise pleasant time. To me, they were essential. How could we build a future if we didn't even know what the other wanted from it? It wasn't just the emotional distance. Our practical differences began to weigh on me as well. The list felt endless: his ambivalence toward having children versus my deep desire to be a parent someday, his tendency to save every penny while I believed in spending a little to enjoy life, our clashing tastes in music and travel. It wasn't about arguing over the radio station or whether to stay in an Airbnb versus a hotel, it was the larger implications. Would we ever find common ground, or would these differences become cracks that widened over time? And yet, for every doubt I had, there were moments that made me second-guess myself. He was good to me, no question about it. He planned thoughtful dates and surprised me with little trips, gestures that showed he cared in his own way. Birthdays and holidays were marked with gifts that reflected how well he knew my tastes. Not once had we raised our voices in an argument or stormed off in anger. Sometimes, though, I wondered if our lack of conflict was less a testament to our compatibility and more a sign that we were avoiding the harder conversations. Were we both so eager to maintain peace that we swept frustrations under the rug, hoping they'd disappear on their own? When he did join me in activities I enjoyed, I saw his effort to make me happy. Whether it was tagging along to a market or grabbing coffee, he rarely said no if he knew it mattered to me. But his willingness to participate often came with a quiet air of obligation rather than enthusiasm. It left me wondering, was it enough to have a partner who would do things for me, or did I need someone who shared my excitement? It wasn't as simple as labeling him as inattentive or me as ungrateful. I wasn't blind to his kindness, and I knew he cared about me. But I also couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something fundamental was missing. It wasn't about fights or flaws, it was about connection. Was I focusing too much on our differences, magnifying them into deal-breakers that didn't need to exist? Or were these differences indicative of a deeper truth that we were good together for now, but not for forever? The lines between gratitude and settling blurred in my mind, leaving me more confused than ever. Our relationship wasn't bad, not by any stretch of the imagination. But was it good enough? That was the question that haunted me as I tried to reconcile my growing doubts with the very real affection I felt for him. And as the clock ticked on, his desire to move forward pressed against my hesitation like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. The Christmas gift incident was, in many ways, the perfect metaphor for our relationship. It was thoughtful and generous, but it lacked the one thing I craved most: an emotional connection. When I opened the bag and saw the beautiful gift inside, my heart warmed at first. He had clearly put effort into choosing something he knew I'd love. But when I looked up, expecting a handwritten note or a card that might give me a glimpse into his thoughts, there was nothing. Just the gift, without context, without sentiment. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or make a big deal out of it, but I couldn't hold back the question, "Why didn't you write a card?" My voice was calm, but I knew my disappointment was evident. He looked at me, slightly bewildered, as if the idea of a card was foreign to him. "I don't really do cards," he said with a small shrug. "But I'll write you one for our anniversary." I nodded and let it go, but inside, the answer stung. It wasn't about the card itself, it was about what the card symbolized: a willingness to open up, to share his feelings, to let me in. He had admitted before that he wasn't an emotional person, that the way he was raised had left him with walls he didn't even realize he had. I wanted to be understanding of that, truly. But how long could I wait for him to meet me halfway? His response to conflict often mirrored his approach to emotional intimacy, deflecting with logic or pointing to past actions as evidence of his care. "If I didn't care, would I have taken you on a trip?" he'd ask when I tried to address how I felt. He wasn't wrong. His actions did show care in their own way. But actions alone weren't enough for me. I needed words, vulnerability, the kind of openness that let me feel like I was truly seen. It was the lack of communication that gnawed at me most. Not because I wanted constant affirmations or deep talks every night, but because I wanted to feel like we were building something real, together. A future built on assumptions and unspoken feelings felt shaky at best and hollow at worst. I replayed the past year in my mind, weighing the good against the bad. There were so many sweet moments, him surprising me with my favorite dessert, holding my hand during a stressful flight, and staying up late to comfort me after a hard day. But those moments were offset by the voids, the times I reached for depth and found only the surface. I questioned myself endlessly. Was I being too demanding? Too harsh? Should I have been more patient? Relationships weren't perfect, and I knew that. But they also weren't meant to feel so one-sided. The more I tried to convince myself to overlook my doubts, the louder they grew. When I thought about moving in together, as he wanted, the idea felt more like a leap of faith than a natural progression. I didn't doubt his intentions, I doubted our compatibility. Would living together bridge the gap, or would it widen it? And if I stayed, how much of myself would I lose in the process? In the end, I realized that love, while important, wasn't always enough. Kindness and care could only take us so far if we weren't willing to face the hard truths about what we needed from each other. I could continue waiting for him to change, to grow, to open up, but at what cost to myself? Breaking up wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't one I made lightly. But I knew that staying in a relationship that left me feeling unseen and unheard would only breed resentment over time. As much as it hurt, I had to let him go, not because he was a bad person, but because we weren't right for each other. When I finally told him, his reaction was as I expected: calm, composed, and quietly sad. He didn't argue or try to convince me to stay. Instead, he nodded and said, "I'm sorry I couldn't give you what you needed." Those words, simple as they were, hit me harder than anything else. For the first time, he acknowledged the truth I had been wrestling with all along. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of closure, bittersweet but necessary. We parted ways with respect and care, but also with the understanding that sometimes love isn't about holding on, it's about knowing when to let go. And as painful as it was, I walked away with the hope that both of us would find the connection we were truly looking for.